Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now let us begin. Story 1. The salt that broke the Republic, the Gabelle tax system. You are in France, but not the one of revolutions, guillotines, or tricolor flags. The France you find yourself in smells of damp parchment and salt-soaked leather sacks. It is the France of the 13th century, where bureaucracy is growing like moss on the ancient stones of royal authority. And in the center of it all, salt. Salt was never just a seasoning, it was preservation, it was survival. Fish from the Atlantic needed it to reach Paris. Beef required it to stay edible past a few days. Even cheese owed some of its longevity to the quiet crystal. The crown knew this, and so did the tax collectors. The Gabelle, the infamous salt tax, did not begin as a singular policy, but rather as a patchwork quilt stitched together by royal decree, regional variants, and desperate fiscal needs. In 1259, under Louis IX, a king remembered as saintly, but also as shrewd, the groundwork was laid when salt started being taxed more regularly in order to fund military campaigns. By the late 14th century, the Gabelle had transformed into a major pillar of French revenue. What began as a temporary war measure morphed into a permanent reality. But the Gabelle was not uniformly applied. France, always a kingdom of contrasts, saw an administrative miracle and nightmare rolled into one. The country was divided into 6 distinct regions based on salt taxation rules. Pays de Grands Gabelles, where the salt tax was highest and most oppressive. Pays de Petites Gabelles, lower rates but still taxed. Pays de Court Bouillon, taxed differently, more leniently. Pays de Salines, areas with their own salt production. Pays Rais de Maize, places that had bought their way out of the tax. Pays exempts privileged zones, like certain border towns or church territories. This fragmentation wasn't incidental, it was administrative design, and it demanded an intricate bureaucratic apparatus. Salt inspectors, Gabelle officers, record keepers, and enforcers, all backed by countless sheets of regulations written in exacting Latin and early French. In the Pays de Grands Gabelles, not only were citizens forced to buy salt, they had to buy a fixed quantity each year, whether they needed it or not. This practice, known as sel obligatoire, turned salt from necessity into burden. Failure to comply could result in severe punishment, including fines, imprisonment, and even death in extreme cases of smuggling. Because smuggling, it became a national pastime. Entire villages near tax borders became silent conspirators. Families passed pouches of untaxed salt through dense woods, across marshes, and through church crypts. Even some clergy looked the other way or profited directly. The fauconniers, salt smugglers, were often simple peasants trying to avoid starvation. But the crown saw them as criminals, and the bureaucracy took no pity. The records from the greniers as sell royal salt warehouses reveal endless ledgers tracking who bought what, when, and where. These bureaucrats weren't faceless. They were neighbors, sometimes relatives, caught between quotas and communal resentment. Their jobs were secure, but their social lives were not. They became the face of unpopular policy. Still, the system worked for a time. Revenue poured in. Wars were financed. Roads were maintained. And the Gabelle bureaucracy expanded, each layer wrapping itself like ivy around the trunk of royal governance. What is most fascinating, though, is how boring the machinery was. No thrilling battles, no sweeping revolutions yet, just slow-moving paper trails, account books, salt carts, and rules. The people resisted not with guns, but with quiet acts of disobedience. They hid salt in barrels. They forged purchase slips. They bribed officials. In return, the bureaucracy grew more meticulous. By the 17th century, the Gabelle had become a state within the state. The intendants overseeing regions often spent more energy managing salt policies than policing crime or enforcing laws. After all, the salt tax was life and death not just for peasants, but for the financial stability of the monarchy. The real intrigue was in the sheer scale of documentation. Thousands of pages detailing something as mundane as salt. It might seem tedious, even absurd, but through these entries, we can trace the veins of a kingdom's beating economic heart. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, what does it mean when survival depends on a system so inflexible, so vast, that it begins to suffocate the very people it claims to serve? You're back in France, but this time the century has changed. It is the early 18th century, and the gabelle has only grown stronger, thicker, and duller in its reach. The salt itself hasn't changed, nor has the French palate, but the machinery surrounding the gabelle now churns with more officials, more documents, and more trouble. The once patchy structure is now deeply entrenched. The firm Gainerail, a tax farming institution operated by private financiers under royal contract, has assumed increasing control of the salt tax collection. These men, the fermiers Gaineraux, paid the crown in advance for the right to collect taxes, including the gabelle, keeping the profits that exceeded the sum. They were not bureaucrats in the classical sense, they were businessmen, and they wanted results. To ensure compliance, the firm Gainerail operated a paramilitary force known as the Maréchaussée, often referred to colloquially as the Gabless, or Salt Police. These weren't mere guards at the warehouse gates. They were trained to track smugglers, raid homes, inspect carts, and even comb through parish cellars to sniff out illicit salt. For the average peasant or merchant, the salt police were a source of deep dread. Their powers extended into daily life in ways that felt profoundly invasive. They could stop travelers on the road, inspect baggage, and arrest anyone suspected of violating salt regulations. The most common violation: simply having salt that wasn't from the official grenier SL. If you were caught with salt from a low-tax region while living in a high-tax region, even if it was gifted, you were considered a criminal. The punishments were harsh. Smugglers, called faux sauniers, were often imprisoned. Repeat offenders could face sentences of hard labor or even galley service, rowing for royal ships under grueling conditions. And while the stories of daring salt runners darting through forest paths sound romantic, the truth was far more monotonous. Men and women trudging through mud, hunched beneath heavy sacks, evading capture not through clever disguises, but through silence and hope. This wasn't just a game of hide-and-seek, it was survival. In some border regions between the Grandes Gabelles and Petites Gabelles, entire economies developed around smuggling. Salt moved quietly through monasteries, hidden cellars, crypts, and shepherd routes. Clergy members sometimes accepted salt as offerings. Farmers buried barrels in stables beneath hay. Bakers maintained two ledgers, one for official salt, one for the kind that actually kept them in business. The firm Gainerail responded with bureaucracy. To trace the movement of salt, a paper trail had to accompany every shipment. Waybills, receipts, and purchase records were required, stamped and re-stamped by officials. Transporters needed licenses, and for each batch of salt sold, documentation had to prove not only origin but intent. What was the salt being used for? How much per capita? Was it for livestock or humans? These seemingly mundane questions required pages of forms and signatures. The paperwork mounted, so did resentment. But within this heavy apparatus, a unique class of French citizens emerged, the clerks of the salt trade. Often born into modest families, they received just enough education to read and write, and they lived lives surrounded by parchment, ink, and silence. Their job: to log every transaction, every discrepancy, and every suspect quantity of salt. Their ledgers often ran hundreds of pages long. They filled in columns by candlelight, logged inspections at dawn, and submitted monthly reports to regional supervisors who compiled even larger volumes. One might imagine this as dull work, and it was. But the sheer volume of documentation required attention to detail bordering on obsession. A single missing number could mean suspicion. A wrong entry might cause a baker to be arrested. Some clerks relished the power that precision gave them. Others despised the role. For every loyal tax scribe who relished the orderliness of Form C-12, salt usage by regional demographics, there was another who smuggled salt under the table to their own families. Then came the communal resistance, not in the form of pitchforks and riots, but paper resistance. Parishes and villages began lodging formal complaints. Petitions were drafted in careful Latin or heavily stylized French, citing overreach, regional hardship, and bureaucratic error. Some cited precedent, referring to exemptions granted centuries prior. Others appealed to regional customs or holy days. A few petitions even succeeded. But the sheer inertia of the Gay Bell's machinery was difficult to slow. For every exemption granted, a new office emerged to verify it. And for every error overturned, 2 more forms were created to prevent recurrence. The Gay Bell had become self-replicating. It is here that we begin to see the birth of bureaucratic distrust among the French people. The government, increasingly removed from the realities of rural life, was seen not as a partner but as a predator. And the clerks, the gabless, and the rent-seeking financiers were its many-headed beast. One must remember that the goal of the Gay Bell was never fairness, it was revenue. And in the palace halls of Versailles, the king needed that revenue to fund palaces, wars, pensions, and diplomatic pageantry. Salt paid for chandeliers. Salt financed muskets. Salt sent ambassadors to Italy. The peasant who couldn't afford a second sack of salt paid, indirectly, for a new wing of the Louvre. And yet, some of the most interesting stories are not of kings, but of small-scale resistance. Take, for example, the village of La Guerche, where in 1727 an entire town coordinated a false salt inventory. Clerks who were sympathetic to the smuggling effort falsified the warehouse ledgers. For 3 years, the operation went unnoticed, until a sudden inspection triggered by a decline in regional tax returns revealed that nearly a quarter of all reported salt sales were fictitious. The punishment. The clerks were dismissed, some imprisoned, but the village never saw a full investigation. Why? Because even the firm Gainerail recognized that pushing too hard could trigger unrest. By the mid-1700s, salt smugglers were often folk heroes, and salt officials, especially the external ones, traveled in groups for protection. Yet the paperwork kept flowing. The receipts piled up. The ledgers thickened. By now, the Gay Bell was less a tax and more a culture of governance. Schools taught the rules. Couriers specialized in salt documentation. Lawyers built careers on Gay Bell disputes. And still the French people simmered. In taverns, in parish meetings, in hushed whispers in the fields, the Gay Bell was not just a tax, it was a symbol of everything unjust, tedious, and overbearing in the monarchy. Not because it was brutal, not because it was violent, but because it was so endlessly boring, and yet so ruinously important. And so the question lingers. What happens when a people learn to endure oppression not through rebellion, but through endless compromise with clerical absurdity? The year is 1789. The slow, dull rhythm of France's bureaucracy is about to be disrupted by something it could neither predict nor withstand: revolution. But even now, in these final days before the Bastille stones would fall, the Gay Bell lived on. Thick with red wax seals, triple copy ledgers, and increasingly absurd enforcement protocols, the salt tax system had ballooned into something more than taxation. It had become an institutional identity. The Gay Bell's paper-based empire spanned the kingdom like arteries, carrying not blood, but official ink. From Grenoble to Rouen, from Bordeaux to Nancy, salt warehouses were fully staffed, ledgers updated, fines collected. And yet, this web of bureaucrats, clerks, and tax farmers had become a hollow shell, an outdated system incapable of reading the room. Because the room was burning. The collapse of trust. For decades leading up to the revolution, Murmurs of discontent had circulated throughout France. But by the late 18th century, they were no longer murmurs. They were minutes of meetings, pamphlets, and open letters, penned in increasingly impassioned tones by not only peasants and smugglers, but also local officials, minor nobles, and even former bureaucrats. Trust in the monarchy had eroded, but trust in the mechanics of royal power, its bureaucracy had collapsed entirely. Why? Because the system had not adapted. Despite inflation, famine, and regional hardship, the salt quotas had remained rigid, the enforcement harsh, and the documentation unrelenting. While Enlightenment thinkers discussed liberty and reason, Gabelists were still dragging villagers into custody over missing salt receipts. The paper trail had become a noose. In the Cahiers de Doléances, the Books of Grievances, compiled in 1789 by citizens across the realm, complaints about the gabelle were near universal. It was not just the tax that angered the people, it was the administrative absurdity that surrounded it. Here is an excerpt from a small village in Auvergne. We are required to purchase salt in quantities exceeding our need from distant warehouses at prices we cannot afford, and with punishments we dare not imagine. The officials are deaf to petitions, and the clerks, while not cruel, are bound by forms and procedures that mock our suffering. This was not rebellion in the form of barricades, it was rebellion through words, through paperwork, through the very medium the bureaucracy had used for centuries to assert control. The tool became the weapon. The gabelle abolished. On March 1, 1790, after months of national upheaval, debate, and political reinvention, the National Constituent Assembly abolished the gabelle. Just like that, the centuries-old system was struck down not with blood, but with emotion and a vote. What followed was chaos, but not the chaos one might imagine. The immediate problem was not political violence, but administrative confusion. Without the gabelle, thousands of clerks, warehouse workers, auditors, and messengers were suddenly redundant. Regional governors scrambled to reassign or dismiss staff. Entire buildings filled with ledgers were shuttered. In one instance in Poitou, an entire salt warehouse was emptied overnight by townspeople who assumed salt was now free. In truth, the new republic had not yet determined how salt should be priced or distributed without the tax structure. The result? Markets flooded. Salt prices plummeted. Meanwhile, bureaucrats quietly burned forms and manuals once considered vital state documents. But while the gabelle was gone, its scars remained. Bureaucratic fallout. What happens when a kingdom's largest bureaucratic system disappears overnight? First, a void opens. Thousands of workers accustomed to the rigid order of forms and ledgers found themselves in limbo. Many had spent decades within the system recording quotas, filing appeals, reconciling accounts. Their identities were tied to function, not to ideology, and when the function disappeared, so too did their relevance. Second, the tools of the old system persisted. Even after the revolution, many regional offices continued to use modified gabelle forms for entirely different purposes: property records, livestock tallies, census counts. The paper stock was too expensive to waste. More importantly, the gabelle structure influenced the emerging revolutionary administration. While the revolutionaries spoke the language of liberty and equality, they still needed order. And who better to provide that order than the former bureaucrats, who knew how to file reports, track data, and enforce policy? So many gabelle clerks found themselves quietly rehired not to tax salt, but to manage grain inventories, requisition orders, and draft lists for the Revolutionary Wars. The bureaucratic state was reborn not as a monarchy's tool, but as a republic's necessity. A legacy in ink. The gabelle may have ended in name, but its legacy endured. In many ways, it was France's first true nationwide bureaucracy, an administrative experiment that reached into nearly every village, monastery, and shop. It proved that a state could maintain control not through soldiers, but through records. And it proved something else, that when bureaucracy ceases to serve the people, it becomes a prison of paper and policy. The salt itself was never to blame. Nor were the clerks, many of whom lived modestly, resigned to their role in a system far larger than themselves. Some tried to reform it, others simply endured it. But the Gay Belle's death signaled a turning point in French history. It marked the moment when tolerance for absurd governance ended, when salt, of all things, became a symbol not of preservation, but of oppression. It also raised a subtle but profound question. Can a government survive if its systems become more complex than the needs they claim to serve? A modern reflection. You might wonder now, reclining in your chair or drifting into sleep, does anything like the Gay Belle still exist today? Are there systems we endure not because they make sense, but because they have grown too big, too intricate, too entrenched to reform? Do we still tolerate bureaucracy that serve themselves before they serve the public? Perhaps it's not just the salt that's outdated. Perhaps it's the way we continue to measure, tax, and control long after the need has passed. The Gay Belle ended with the fall of the monarchy, but its spirit lives on wherever paperwork outweighs purpose, wherever procedures replace people, and wherever the boring, grinding wheels of administration continue to turn without question. So the next time you fill out a form or wait in line, or are told that's just the process, remember this. Once in France, salt nearly broke a nation not with fire but with paper. Story 2. The Paperwork of Power, the Rise of Royal Clerks. The year is 987 CE, and the Carolingian dynasty has just faded into history. Hugh Capet has assumed the throne of France, but his kingdom is fragmented, feudal, and far from centralized. Lords rule their territories like miniature kings. Castles dot the hills, and loyalty to the crown is more theoretical than practical. But amid this disjointed landscape, a subtle revolution is beginning, not with swords or banners, but with quills and parchment. You are in the company of a royal clerk or clerk du roi, one of the earliest members of an emerging class that would eventually shape the French monarchy's authority not through might, but through paperwork. The crown, weak as it was, needed to keep records. Marriage alliances, land grants, legal rulings, and diplomatic agreements all required documentation. Without writing, there could be no continuity, and continuity in an unstable kingdom was power. At first, the task of recording royal business fell to monks and abbots, the only people literate enough to compose official charters. These documents were painstakingly written in Latin, adorned with intricate calligraphy, and sealed with wax. They were often stored in monasteries, guarded as sacred objects. But as royal affairs grew in complexity, so too did the need for a dedicated secular bureaucracy. By the 11th and 12th centuries, kings had begun to recruit clerks from the expanding class of educated laymen, men trained in cathedral schools, literate in Latin, and versed in legal formulas. They were not nobles, they were not priests, they were not warriors. They were technocrats before the term existed. The clerk as a state builder. The royal clerk was not merely a scribe, he was an architect of royal memory. Each time a clerk recorded a land donation, he not only preserved the deed but reinforced the idea that the king's word mattered, that there was a line of authority connecting past decisions to present ones, that the king, unlike a feudal baron, could govern not only through proximity but through documents. The earliest royal chancery's offices responsible for producing and managing royal documents were modest: a few desks, a few scribes, a supply of vellum or parchment, a supply of gall ink, but their influence was massive. Under kings like Philip I and Louis VI, clerks began developing standardized phrases for royal charters. These included expressions like datum per manum regis, given by the hand of the king; in perpetuum valiturum, to remain valid in perpetuity. This language, dry and formulaic, may seem tedious, but it was foundational. It turned spoken commands into lasting obligations, and in doing so, it elevated the authority of the monarch over time and space. By the 13th century, under Louis IX, St. Louis, the royal chancery had become a formal institution, with hierarchical ranks of clerks, scribes, and recorders. At the top sat the Chancellor of France, a powerful figure who was often also a bishop or archbishop. The Chancellor oversaw the production of royal letters, ordinances, land grants, and diplomatic communiques. Every official act of the king passed through the Chancery, and for each act, there was a clerk whose hand brought it into being. Imagine, for a moment, a quiet chamber in the Louvre Palace long before it became a museum. A row of desks, shelves filled with scrolls, the smell of wax, ink, and drying parchment. In one corner, a clerk is hunched over a document, copying line after line in precise Gothic script. Another is preparing a royal seal for affixing. Their work is slow, boring even, but it builds the kingdom. Record-keeping as legitimacy. What made a French king legitimate? For centuries, legitimacy was tied to coronation at Reims, where the sacred oil of Clovis was used to anoint new monarchs. But increasingly, it was also tied to paper. A king's ability to grant land, issue justice, and negotiate with foreign powers required formal recognition, and that recognition came through clerical documentation. The clerks didn't just write down decisions, they helped shape them. Because the king was not omnipresent, his clerks were his memory, and memory in politics is everything. When disputes arose over property lines or succession, the first question was not who is stronger, but what does the document say? And who kept the documents? The clerks. This gave them quiet, invisible power. Bureaucratic language and the rise of French. For centuries, clerical documents were written exclusively in Latin. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, something remarkable began to occur. French began to appear in official records. Why? Because the kingdom was expanding, and not all subjects could understand Latin. Kings wanted their commands to be understood by local officials, town councils, and merchants. Clerks began drafting ordinances, edicts, and letters patent in langue dial, the vernacular that would eventually become modern French. This shift was not fast. It took generations, but it helped shape the French language itself, standardizing spelling, grammar, and official vocabulary. It also brought governance closer to the people. And who managed this linguistic transition? Clerks, not poets, not nobles, not revolutionaries, bureaucrats with quills. Career clerks and social mobility. Unlike nobles, royal clerks could rise through merit. A talented scribe could become a secretary, then a royal counselor, then perhaps an intendant or ambassador. Their upward path was not gilded, but it existed. By the 14th century, it became common for clerks to pass their positions to sons or nephews, creating small dynasties of bureaucrats. Families like the de Marles, de l'Hôpital, and Letellier became known for their generations of service in the chancery. But the daily life of a clerk remained painfully mundane. Work began before dawn. Letters had to be copied 3 times, ink spoiled, parchment curled, quills snapped. Mistakes required entire documents to be redone. The average clerk spent more time with ink pots than with his own family. And yet without them, the kingdom would grind to a halt. Because no matter how strong a king's will, if it was not written, it might as well have never existed. The invisible machine. By the end of the 14th century, France had not only a king, but a paper-based memory. Edicts from Paris reached Normandy. Legal decisions echoed in Provence. Marriage alliances were catalogued. Land tenures were cross-checked against monastery holdings. War declarations were archived and trade tariffs standardized. This wasn't accidental, it was bureaucratic genius. The clerks of France, mostly unknown to history, created a parallel monarchy, one of seals, forms, archives, and formulas. They translated royal will into structure, and structure into rule. And though they wore no crowns, bore no swords, and made no speeches, they built the monarchy with boring precision. But can a system so dependent on the written word survive the chaos of war and shifting loyalties? Can clerical stability endure when kings fall and invasions begin? The kingdom is no longer at peace. It is the mid-14th century, and France is at the edge of a long and brutal conflict, the 100 Years' War. As English armies advance and alliances falter, the structure of the monarchy begins to creak under the pressure. But in the royal chancery, the clerks do not stop writing. In fact, they work more than ever. Because war, paradoxically, makes bureaucracy grow. It demands taxes, levies, treaties, troop deployments, and endless documentation. And it is the clerks, those quiet architects of administrative order, who must now scramble to translate chaos into paperwork. Crisis management in parchment. You might imagine that in a time of war, writing would be secondary to fighting. But for medieval France, this was not the case. Each campaign required orders of mobilization, sent to every region, specifying which nobles owed troops and supplies. Ration records, detailed logs of flour, salted meat, wine, and horses for each detachment. Letters of credit, enabling armies to requisition goods from merchants and towns. Tax assessments, imposed on peasants, burgesses, and ecclesiastical landholders to fund the crown's campaigns. Safe conduct passes, for envoys, priests, and civilians to move through battle zones. All of this had to be documented, duplicated, and filed, and all of it required a clerk's hand. Royal clerks were no longer confined to the chancery rooms in Paris or Tours. They traveled with field chanceries, mobile offices that accompanied armies or royal court movements during crises. These included carts loaded with paper, wax, chests of seals, and ledgers. The enemy might destroy a fortress, but the king's commands, inscribed on durable vellum and stored in iron-bound boxes, would survive. Even as cities fell, the record keepers endured. Clerks in the tax state. One of the most profound impacts of the 100 Years' War on French bureaucracy was the permanent expansion of the royal tax state. To finance the war, kings like Philip VI and Charles V had to move beyond traditional feudal levies. They began implementing more consistent statewide taxes, chief among them the taille, a direct land tax; the aide, a consumption tax on goods like wine; the gabelle, which you know well by now, salt. These taxes required systems, and those systems needed clerks. Each region had tax offices, assessment boards, appeal systems, and accounting chambers. Clerks were responsible not only for writing edicts, but for keeping track of who owed what, who paid, and who had royal exemptions. Here we see the emergence of fiscal bureaucracy as a profession distinct from legal or chancery writing. A clerk in Rouen might spend his entire career doing nothing but tracking wine tariffs. Another in Lyon might handle noble tax exemptions, cross-referencing genealogies and royal favors. This was not exciting work. It involved dull repetition, complex filing, and constant correspondence with Paris. But it enabled the war to continue, long after armies should have collapsed under their own logistical burdens. Bureaucratic language as power. At this point in history, the bureaucratic language of the monarchy is solidifying. Royal edicts now contain language like, "By the grace of God, King of France, it is decreed. Let it be known to all who see these letters. We ordain and command, under penalty of forfeiture." These phrases were more than formalities, they established legitimacy. In a kingdom under threat, where borders shifted and allegiance was fragile, it was the documents that bound reality. A command written in official form, sealed with the royal sigil, was a form of legal magic. It made the king's will real, even in places he could not reach with armies. And behind every phrase, every line, there was a clerk, anonymous, patient and precise. Women and the clerical shad. It's worth noting that, although clerical positions were almost entirely male, women were not absent from the bureaucracy. In convents, abbesses and nuns managed substantial estates and corresponded regularly with the crown. They employed female scribes to manage monastic records, draft contracts, and catalog donations. In some urban areas, especially in southern France, merchant widows took over family bookkeeping roles, writing contracts in the local dialect and submitting records to royal tax offices. While not formally part of the royal clerk class, these women operated within the same paper ecosystem, often corresponding with officials and fulfilling obligations with scrupulous care. The expansion of royal bureaucracy indirectly expanded female literacy, at least among elite and urban populations. It created a world in which women had to read ordinances, edicts, and contracts, even if they couldn't write them. Disruption and recovery, the Black Death. Then came the plague. The Black Death, beginning in 1347, decimated the French population. In some areas, up to half of the clerical workforce perished. Entire chancery departments collapsed. Field offices went dark. Tax assessments failed because the taxpayers were gone. In Paris, the royal chancery went through 3 full restaffings in a single decade. The response: more bureaucracy. After the worst wave subsided, the monarchy initiated clerical recruitment drives. Cathedral schools trained more scribes. Universities like Orleans and Paris saw surges in enrollment for legal and administrative studies. The goal was to rebuild not just armies but the paper infrastructure of the kingdom. It's here that we see the birth of career administrators, men who never expected to hold land, wear armor, or enter the clergy, but who would spend their entire lives writing, recording, and verifying. They wore plain robes, carried ink-stained fingers, and often died unnoticed. But they held the kingdom together when war, disease, and politics tore it apart. The rise of the notaire du roi. By the late 14th century, a new kind of official had emerged, the notaire du roi, notary of the king. These men were authorized to act in the king's name, drafting and authenticating contracts, treaties, land transfers, wills, and more. Their seal carried legal authority, and their ledgers became repositories of national memory. To become a royal notary required formal education in law, certification by the crown, oaths of loyalty, mastery of formulaic Latin and evolving French. Notaries operated throughout the kingdom, not only in Paris, but in Dijon, Toulouse, Avignon, and dozens of smaller towns. In their records, you can trace the ordinary workings of power: how a vineyard changed hands, how a widow claimed her dower rights, how a noble's estate was divided among his sons. Each of these acts, boring on the surface, was a building block of governance, and each bore the signature, or rather, the flourish of a royal clerk. War, memory, and bureaucratic continuity. Despite war, plague, and political instability, the French monarchy did something rare for a medieval state. It maintained administrative continuity. Documents from 1330 reference earlier charters from 1220. Edicts in 1400 cite policies from 1315. Legal decisions from 1375 are reviewed in 1420. This was possible only because of a sustained commitment to documentation and to the clerks who guarded it. It's easy to dismiss these men as boring, even soulless, but they were also custodians of law, preservers of rights, and witnesses to generations. They may not have worn crowns, but their ink-shaped kingdoms. Still, one must ask, if the clerks preserved order through all these crises, What happens when the crown itself begins to falter? Can a bureaucracy outlive the monarchy it serves? By the 17th century, the French monarchy had transformed. The kingdom was no longer a scattered patchwork of semi-autonomous baronies. It had become something more centralized, more controlled, and vastly more bureaucratic. At the center of this transformation stood the royal clerk, no longer just a humble scribe in the shadow of the chancery, but an integrated part of a national administrative machine. And yet, as we approach the eve of the French Revolution, we begin to see the limits of this machine. What once served the crown faithfully now risked becoming a weight around its neck. Let us return to the desk, not the battlefield, not the throne, but the desk where paper and ink quietly shaped the fate of kings. Bureaucracy ascendant, the age of absolutism. With the rise of Louis XIII and especially Louis XIV, the Sun King, the French state entered the era of absolutism. The king ruled by divine right, and all power, theoretically, flowed from him. But divine will could not move armies or collect taxes without clerical infrastructure. Enter the intendants, royally appointed administrators, many of whom began their careers as clerks. They oversaw provinces, implemented royal policy, supervised justice, coordinated tax collection, and reported back to Paris. These intendants relied on an ever-growing army of clerks, secretaries, and auditors who tracked and tabulated every coin and contract in service to the king's vision of order. What's striking is not the drama but the dullness. Intendants didn't fight wars. They sent letters, thousands of them. They didn't build roads with their hands. They authorized funds, reviewed accounts, and cross-checked reports from local officials. They resolved disputes by referencing precedents and parchments, not precedent-setting speeches. Every reform, every royal ordinance, every tax reform from Colbert to Necker was filtered through bureaucratic layers built by generations of clerks. And with each new reform came new forms, new ledgers, new filing systems. France became, in essence, a kingdom of administrators. Bureaucratic stratification, paper as power. By the 18th century, royal administration was stratified into competing bureaucracies. The Chancery, for royal letters and legal edicts. The Cour des Aides, for tax disputes and exemptions. The Parlements, registering royal laws. The Firmes Gagnerails, collecting key taxes, including the Gabelle. The Chambre des Comptes, auditing royal finances. Each had its own staff, procedures, and documentation. Many shared overlapping duties, creating turf wars between departments. Yet all relied on the same human machinery, clerks. These clerks were no longer simply literate, they were specialized. There were clerks of the king's household, clerks of the navy, clerks for ecclesiastical matters, clerks of inventory and infrastructure, clerks whose sole job was to copy correspondence word for word. Each specialized in the correct phrasing, formulas, and procedures unique to their department. To write the wrong introductory clause on an official letter could invalidate the entire document. It was tedious, yes, but it was also a source of immense institutional continuity. The French monarchy, unlike many of its European rivals, could trace its policies across centuries because its clerks never stopped writing. A career of ink and isolation. To be a clerk in this era was to be intensely regulated and deeply obscure. Most clerks worked 6 days a week, copying entries by hand with obsessive neatness. Many died with no personal wealth, their legacy reduced to the initials at the bottom of a page in an archive. Salaries were modest, offices were often cold and crowded, promotions came slowly if at all. And yet many families fought to enter the clerical class. Why? Because it offered something rare, stability. In an era of crop failures, foreign wars, and shifting noble alliances, a position in the king's administration, however minor, meant food, lodging, and a place in the growing apparatus of power. Some rose. One generation's clerk might beget a future counselor, even a minister, but most remained in the margins, vital and invisible. Cracks in the ink-stained wall. But beneath this facade of order, cracks were forming. The state had become too large, too complex, and too dependent on inefficient structures. Each reform simply layered new paperwork atop the old, like a collapsing archive of regulations. Take, for example, tax exemptions. By the 1780s, tens of thousands of noble families had individual exemptions, many written centuries earlier and never standardized. To confirm or deny one required pulling ledgers from 3, sometimes 4 separate repositories, each managed by its own clerical staff, following its own filing rules. The result: delays, duplications, contradictions, and increasingly resentment. For while the elite navigated the maze with private lawyers and connections, peasants and townspeople found themselves trapped. Taxes were high, paperwork was dense, appeals took years, and the clerks, once seen as instruments of order, now appeared as defenders of injustice, not because they were cruel, but because they were indifferent. They followed rules. The rules no longer made sense, but they followed them anyway. Bureaucrats in the storm. When the revolution came in 1789, it did not begin by burning the chancery, but it quickly engulfed the bureaucracy. Suddenly, the system that had served the crown for centuries was untrustworthy. Clerks were accused of being agents of royal tyranny. Archives were seized. Officials were dismissed, interrogated, even imprisoned. Documents were burned not out of hatred for paper, but for what that paper had come to represent: oppression disguised as order. And yet, even amid revolutionary fury, the need for clerks did not vanish. The National Assembly passed decrees. Who wrote them? Clerks. The Directory needed tax collectors. Who coordinated them? Clerks. The Napoleonic Code had to be printed, copied, and distributed to every department. Who did that? Clerks. The monarchy was gone, the titles had changed, but the jobs remained. A final reflection: the legacy of royal clerks. The story of France's royal clerks is not one of glory or fame. It is a story of quiet endurance. From the dusty scriptoria of the 11th century to the crowded offices of 18th century Paris, these men, and they were nearly always men, wrote the country into being. They documented its borders, codified its laws, recorded its alliances, managed its wealth. They were not artists. They were not revolutionaries. They were custodians of state memory, wielding no weapon but the pen. And while the crown they served has long since fallen, their legacy survives in every modern civil service, every ministry, every filing cabinet humming under fluorescent light. It is easy to dismiss them, to mock the paperwork, to yawn at the ledgers. But without the clerks, the monarchy would have been only a myth, not a mechanism. And so we end this story with a question. If bureaucracy was once the force that gave the monarchy its lasting shape, what happens when modern governments, too, become so buried in systems that function overtakes purpose? Are we still living inside the files they created? Story 3. Sealed with wax: the great French notarial tradition. You're seated at a heavy wooden desk in a narrow office off a dusty street in medieval Toulouse. The smell of warm wax mingles with dried ink. Shelves behind you are stacked with scrolls and ledgers, each rolled tightly and secured with ribbons, some barely faded with age. A man in sober robes is hunched over a large piece of parchment, writing slowly, carefully, pausing only to check a ledger by his elbow. When he finishes, he takes a lump of red wax, warms it over a candle, presses a metal seal into it, and leaves his mark. You are in the office of a notaire, a notary, and he is doing what notaries have done in France for centuries, documenting the mundane, the legal, and the essential fabric of life. Unlike clerks of the royal chancery, who served the king and his government, notaries served the people well, the literate, landowning, and economically involved segments of the people. Yet in their own way, they wielded just as much long-term influence. The French notarial tradition is a story of trust, formality, and boring but essential permanence. The notary was not there to decide right or wrong, but to witness, record, and authenticate. He was both public and private, state-sanctioned but locally grounded. And through his careful documentation of contracts, land sales, wills, and dowries, he helped build the entire legal infrastructure of France. The notary's birthplace, southern France and Roman roots. The tradition of notarial writing in France has deep, ancient roots reaching back to the legacy of Roman law. In the south of France, especially in regions like Provence, Languedoc, and Aquitaine, Roman legal principles remained especially strong due to centuries of uninterrupted influence. Under Roman law, notari were scribes and legal functionaries responsible for transcribing official proceedings. When Rome fell, these traditions didn't vanish, they morphed. By the 10th and 11th centuries, southern France had developed a localized version of the Roman notarial system. Here, lay notaries, men who were not part of the church, began to emerge as important civic actors. They worked under the authority of local counts, bishops, or town councils, but they were not simply secretaries. They were legal artisans, entrusted with preserving agreements in a world where memory alone was not enough. Unlike in the north, where royal or ecclesiastical bureaucracy dominated, the South's communal cities and urban traditions created fertile ground for professional notaries. These men formed guilds, passed exams, and were bound by legal ethics centuries before the formal creation of a national legal code. The rise of the public notary. By the 13th century, notaries in France had taken on an official role. They were now officiers publics, public officers given state authority to validate contracts. Their essential power. They could produce documents that were self-authenticating. Once signed and sealed by a notary, a document carried presumed legal validity. It didn't need to be proven in court. It was trusted by default. This is crucial. In a kingdom where most people could not read, and where fraud was rampant, a notary's seal was as valuable as a sword or a coin. It could prove ownership, establish rights, guarantee payment, and pass property to children. The notary didn't enforce laws, but he created the paper reality that laws depended on. Consider this. A peasant inherits a vineyard. A widow receives her dowry back after her husband's death. A merchant buys warehouse space in Marseille. A noble arranges the marriage of his third son. In each case, a notary is present, parchment in hand. He writes the terms, confirms the identities, witnesses the agreement, and presses his seal. That document then becomes part of the legal and social fabric of France. Without that seal, none of it exists in the eyes of the law. Wax seals and formulas. Seals were not just decoration. They were identity, authority, and permanence. Each notary had his own metal seal stamp, often bearing initials, a coat of arms, or a symbolic image. The wax color and shape sometimes indicated the document's importance. The process of sealing was ritualistic. The wax was softened over flame. A small glob was applied to the parchment, or attached via silk cords. The seal was pressed slowly, firmly, and left to cool. This moment was the legal birth of the document. Many notaries also used standardized language, known as formules, developed over centuries and carefully memorized. They might begin a will with, "In the year of our Lord, on the day of the month of before me, notary public of the town of." These phrases, boring, repetitive, endlessly copied, were the foundation of legal consistency. They ensured that a contract written in Lyon could be understood in Dijon, and a will drawn up in Aix-en-Provence would be accepted in Paris. And since the notary was bound by law to retain a copy, or minute, of each act in his register, he also became an early archivist, a guardian of memory not for kings, but for townspeople, traders, and families. Notaries and the architecture of daily life. The work of a notary was not glamorous. It involved long hours, repetitive tasks, and impeccable attention to detail. But through this monotony, notaries stitched together the legal foundation of everyday life. Some of the documents they produced included wills and testaments, clarifying inheritance and family claims; marriage contracts, specifying dowries, property arrangements, and succession rights; sales and transfers, recording the movement of land, homes, shops, or livestock; business partnerships, agreements between merchants or craftsmen; loans and promissory notes, regulating debts and repayments. What unified all these acts was the principle of traceability. If there was a dispute, you could go to the notary's register, pull the copy, and prove your case. And because notaries were required to retain documents for decades, their archives became some of France's richest historical records. Today, historians still rely on these dusty volumes to reconstruct the lives of ordinary people, their fears, ambitions, mistakes, and compromises. A marriage contract might reveal not just names and dates, but furniture lists, land descriptions, and even emotional subtext between families negotiating terms. Through the notary, the private became public. Status and reputation. Unlike many royal clerks, notaries were visible figures in their communities. They had offices with signage. They dressed in sober but respectable attire. Their reputation mattered deeply. A notary caught falsifying a document, omitting facts, or favoring one party over another could be stripped of his seal, fined, or even imprisoned. This made trust a professional currency. As such, many notaries became pillars of local society. They served on town councils. They advised merchants. Some even became confidants to nobles and bishops. Their children often followed them into the trade, apprenticing for years before receiving the royal commission. By the 16th century, notarial families were commonplace, and some became wealthy dynasties not through land or titles, but through paper, precision, and patience. The unseen nation. While kings ruled from Versailles and armies marched across Europe, it was notaries who held France's internal structure together. Their signatures stretched from Basque Country to the Alps, from Paris to Perpignan. They documented the rebuilding after wars, the return of soldiers, the restitution of property, the negotiation of peace even during the wars of religion. When faith divided cities, the notarial seal still carried legal force. It did not matter whether the document was Catholic or Protestant, Royalist or Republican, the notarial form remained consistent. Because above all, the notary was not partisan. He was procedural. He did not argue, he did not judge. He wrote, witnessed, and sealed. And in doing so, he created the conditions for law to function at scale. But a question emerges as we peer deeper into this paper-filled world. If the notary gave order to society through documentation, what happens when society itself begins to reject the very principles of order, class, and continuity that these documents were meant to uphold? In short, what becomes of the seal when the state itself is melted down? It is now the 17th century, and France is deep in the grip of absolutism. The royal court has moved to Versailles. The nobility is increasingly centralized under the watchful eye of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. Great wars are fought, taxes are raised, and the monarchy reaches for ever more control. And yet, beyond the court's gilded halls and the whispers of diplomacy, another quiet structure hums along. The network of notaries, ever sealing, ever recording, ever enduring. In cities, towns, and rural villages, these men carry out their work untouched by glory but bound by ritual. Their seals mark the marriages of bakers, the debts of tailors, the wills of wine merchants. They are ever present, yet rarely acknowledge the maintenance workers of legal society. In this section, we enter the notary's golden age, a period in which their role became fully institutionalized, state-sanctioned, and deeply embedded in the fabric of monarchy and community alike. Royal authority and notarial monopoly. By the late 1500s and into the 1600s, the French crown had begun taking more direct control over the notarial profession. Where once notaries were largely appointed by bishops, town councils, or local seigneurs, they were now increasingly licensed by the king himself. This was not just about oversight, it was about revenue. The monarchy discovered that selling the office of notary, a practice called la venalité des offices, was a dependable source of income. For a fee, you could purchase a notarial charge and pass it to your heirs. This made the notary's role something of a heritable profession, attracting ambitious bourgeois families eager to secure a stable, respected post. The fees were steep, but they came with perks. A monopoly on legal documentation in a geographic area. The power of authentication backed by royal decree. A near-guaranteed income from clients who had no legal alternative. And so the notary, once a scribe of uncertain social standing, became a pillar of the legal order, licensed by the monarchy and protected by law. But with royal privilege came royal regulation. The state required notaries to maintain double copies of every act, submit annual reports to regional royal courts, keep detailed registers available for inspection, be audited periodically for any signs of fraud or error. In practice, this meant more paperwork, more rules, more layers of process. Yet most notaries accepted the burden because it came with legitimacy. The language of law, from Latin to French. During this period, we see the near-complete transition from Latin to French in notarial documents. This was no small shift. Latin had long been the language of the law, of tradition, of universality. But French vernacular, evolving, regional, was the language of the people. And the state, always eager for control, wanted its edicts, contracts, and registries to be readable, enforceable, and local. Notaries had to adjust. They studied legal French, memorized formulas in the new idiom, and adopted standardized phrasing. Still, the form of the document remained deeply conservative. Every notarial act followed a template. A preamble stating the date and parties. A narration of the agreement. A declaration of intent and witness. A validation clause, sealed and signed. Here's a typical excerpt from a 1684 marriage contract from Angoulême. Today, in the year of our Lord, before me, Jean Dupin, notary royal, appeared Jean-Baptiste Charpentier and Marie-Anne Lemon, who have agreed and consented as follows. To modern ears, this sounds formal and dull, but for contemporaries, it was assurance, a signal that what followed was real, binding, and permanent. And every word, every comma, was chosen with deliberate care. The archive of ordinary lives. One of the notary's most overlooked contributions is the historical archive he unintentionally created. In obeying the law's requirement to preserve minute copies of every act, notaries built a paper record of French life stretching across centuries. These acts were stored in large registry volumes, sometimes organized by type, wills, sales, contracts, or by client name. Many were carefully indexed. Some were beautifully bound in leather, others were humble stacks tied with twine. Today, these archives held in French departmental archives, often under the heading Minutes Notarials, are a goldmine for historians. What do they reveal? Family structures, how people passed property between generations. Economic activity, prices of land, goods, and labor. Social norms, marital expectations, dowry customs, inheritance plans. linguistic change, the slow shift in vocabulary, spelling, and grammar. But more than that, they reveal lives lived beneath the level of history, people who never made it into royal decrees or military reports, but whose legal footprints endure. And the guide through it all, the notary. The notarial oath. To serve as a notary was not just a matter of skill, it was a matter of honor. Upon appointment, every notary took a solemn oath, pledging to serve faithfully and impartially, avoid favoritism, bribery, and deception, keep client information confidential, preserve records without alteration. Violating this oath could mean immediate dismissal, loss of status, and legal penalties. And yet fraud still happened. Some notaries falsified documents for family or friends. Others lost records under pressure. There are cases of notaries who were expelled from their town, stripped of their seal, or even prosecuted for falsifying inheritance contracts or forging dates on promissory notes. But these cases were rare. In most towns, the notary was seen as an honest broker, a man of letters and logic, present at birth, marriage, and death. He was, in a very real way, a human ledger. When the notary met the noble, notaries didn't just serve merchants and farmers. They also worked for nobles, clergy, and government officials. The nobility of the robe, especially, made frequent use of notaries to secure land deals, create trust funds for daughters, and craft succession plans. Sometimes, noble families kept one preferred notary for generations, building an intimate knowledge of estates and family history. These relationships gave notaries access to power, but also responsibility. The larger the estate, the greater the pressure to manage it wisely. In some cases, notaries even became confidants or fixers, helping their elite clients navigate tax rules, arrange quiet debt settlements, or register land discreetly to avoid scrutiny. But always with a seal at the bottom. The monotony of significance. The notary's life was repetitive. Day after day, clients arrived with nearly identical needs: a deed to sign, a dowry to settle, a will to amend. And each time the notary followed procedure: dates, names, conditions, clauses, seal. It may seem trivial, but this repetition was not meaningless. It built a world where people could trust the system, where laws were not merely spoken, but embodied in ink and wax, where society could function without force because there were rules on paper and a man who could prove they were followed. The notary did not rule France, but without him, France could not have been ruled. And yet, as the century turned toward revolution, the notarial seal, once so reassuring, began to represent something else. Not justice, but privilege. Because notaries, like other office holders, were tied to the venality of office, passing their status down like property. In a time when revolutionary ideals demanded equality, the hereditary notarial class looked increasingly out of touch. So the question arises: if the seal was once a symbol of law and trust, can it survive in a world where inheritance, hierarchy, and procedure are being torn down? It is 1789, and the streets of Paris buzz with pamphlets, speeches, and unease. In Versailles, the Estates General debates the rights of man. In villages and cities across France, people riot over bread, over tax, over the burden of a monarchy that seems distant and deaf. And tucked away in a quiet, book-lined office, a notary opens his ledger just as he did yesterday and the day before that. But something has changed. Because this time, the ink he sets to parchment may not last. The notarial system on the eve of revolution. By the late 18th century, the notarial profession in France was at its height: numerous, standardized, and hierarchical. The crown had long since turned notarial offices into saleable properties, part of the venalité des offices, through which many state positions were bought, inherited, and passed on like investments. This had created an entire notarial class, especially among the bourgeoisie wealthy families in cities like Lyon, Bordeaux, Marseille, and Paris who had no noble title, but immense influence. Many families had served as notaries for generations, often intertwining with local merchants, lawyers, and urban officials. To the average person, the notary was still a respected presence, but increasingly, he also symbolized the frozen hierarchy of the ancient regime. Because his office was expensive to purchase, his seal gave him legal authority unavailable to others. His records often privileged those with property, literacy, and connections. His position was protected not by democratic trust, but by royal license. So as revolutionary ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity spread like fire through France, the notary's role was quietly, dangerously called into question. The revolution strikes the seals. In 1791, as revolutionary fervor deepened and the monarchy began to unravel, the National Constituent Assembly turned its attention to France's massive tangle of venal offices. Among its reforms, abolition of venality, offices could no longer be bought or inherited. Standardization of legal roles, notaries would be appointed based on merit and need, not money. Creation of departments, France's new administrative units would reorganize the placement and number of notarial offices. Suddenly, hundreds of hereditary notaries lost their privilege. Those who had paid dearly for their office, often treating it as a form of family investment, were now told, "Your position is no longer protected." Some were allowed to remain provisionally, others were dismissed entirely. Revolutionary courts now oversaw the appointment of new notaries, often favoring younger, more ideologically aligned candidates. And yet, the revolution did not abolish the notarial role itself. Why? Because even the most radical ideologues understood that contracts still needed to be witnessed, property recorded, wills filed, and debts verified. In fact, the more society was torn apart, the more necessary it became to have anyone trusted to write it all down. Revolutionary notaries serving a new France. Between 1791 and 1804, France experimented with multiple iterations of legal and bureaucratic reforms. Amid this chaos, the notary survived, albeit transformed. They were no longer agents of the crown. Now they were servants of the nation. Their acts no longer bore the royal fleur-de-lis seal. They bore republican headings, or the mark of the newly created tribunals. Their language changed. Two phrases once heavy with monarchical flattery were replaced with more neutral, civic formulations. Consider the contrast. Before, by the grace of God and the authority of His Majesty the King. After, in the name of the French people, under the law of the Republic. Notaries began registering sales of confiscated church and noble land, part of the Biens Nationaux property seized and auctioned by the state. Their ledgers, once filled with dowries and family contracts, now recorded revolutionary redistributions. But many of these new acts had their roots in the same boring structure. Names, dates, clauses, signatures, seals. The framework of trust remained intact even as the system of power collapsed around it. Napoleon and the notarial renaissance. The true refounding of the modern French notarial tradition came not during the Terror, nor during the Directory, but under Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1804, as first consul, soon to be emperor, Napoleon issued the Code Civil, or the Napoleonic Code, a vast reorganization of French law, based on clarity, consistency, and rational order. At the center of this legal vision stood the notaire. The Napoleonic Code made the notary an essential component of civil law. The acte authentique, a document drawn up by a certified notary, was made binding, irrefutable, and enforceable. The notary was re-established as a public official, now appointed by the state, not by private purchase. The law required notaries to maintain archives, practice in specific districts, communes or cantons, submit to inspections and audits, be neutral, impartial, and legally trained. With these reforms, the modern notary was born, a hybrid of legal technician, public archivist, and neutral witness, tasked with making French civil society functional and coherent. It was, ironically, the most revolution-proof profession in France. The unbroken thread. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the notarial office had been preserved, renovated, yes, but fundamentally the same in purpose: to give legal form to private life, to bear witness, to preserve order through paperwork. And though kings returned, republics rose and fell, and wars came again, the notary remained. His tools, still parchment, ink, and seal. His concerns, still debt, inheritance, marriage, property. The revolutions did not destroy the notary, they clarified his purpose. A quiet legacy. Today, across France, notaries still exist, licensed, regulated, respected. Their offices are modern now, of course. Seals are digital, archives are scanned, but the core procedure remains unchanged. You enter, you explain, they write, they validate, and you walk away with a document that holds weight under the law. And in some offices, if you ask, they'll show you a bound register from the 1600s, 1700s, even earlier, full of names long dead, clauses long obsolete, but ink that still tells the truth of what was agreed and when. This is the power of boring history, silent, steady, and still shaping the present. A final reflection. The notary is not a revolutionary. He does not change the world, but he records the change. He does not resist injustice with violence. He resists with precision. In a world of turmoil, he remains the constant clerk, binding societies together with language, law, and form. So next time you sign a contract, authorize a transfer, or draft a will, consider this. You are participating in a tradition older than the Republic, older than the monarchy, one that survived kings, revolutions, and empires. All because someone, somewhere, sealed a piece of parchment with wax and promised to remember. Story 4. Of Dukes and Ledgers, Burgundy's bureaucratic might. It is the mid-14th century, and the Kingdom of France is a fractured, war-torn landscape. While the Valois kings try to assert dominance from Paris, one of their own cousins is building something altogether different, a realm that operates not merely by force, but through formality, record-keeping, and administrative precision. You are now in the court of Philip the Bold, first Valois Duke of Burgundy, who in 1363 received the duchy as a gift from his father, King John II of France. But this was not a typical feudal appointment. It was the beginning of one of the most administratively advanced and independently governed regions in medieval Europe. Because the Duchy of Burgundy, far from being a sleepy corner of the kingdom, would soon become a bureaucratic powerhouse, a state within a state that rivaled even the French crown in its capacity to tax, legislate, and archive. This is not the Burgundy of wine labels or tourist brochures. This is ledger-bound Burgundy, where clerks outnumbered knights, where policy was debated in parchment, and where a duke's power was built not just on bloodlines, but on binders. Burgundy as a bureaucratic laboratory. From its inception under Philip the Bold, the Duchy of Burgundy operated differently than most medieval territories. Where other lords relied on tradition and personal loyalty, Burgundy developed a structured administration, one with departments, offices, and clearly defined duties. The Duke's court was modeled not just on chivalry, but on efficiency. Here, what made it unique? A central chancellery, responsible for all ducal edicts, land grants, and correspondence. A financial council which tracked revenue, set taxes, and negotiated loans. regional estates, états provinciaux, that documented the obligations of towns and nobles alike. Professional auditors, who examined accounts and verified expenditures. This wasn't improvisational rule, it was proto-modern governance. Even at this early stage, Burgundy maintained duplicate ledgers, indexed registries and policy archives, stored in chateaux, castles, and even fortified city halls. As early as 1370, Philip the Bold's chancery had standardized document formats, complete with preambles, witness clauses, and filing instructions. The administrative staff included scribes for correspondence, tabellions for civil acts, controllers of salt and grain, legal clerks for internal disputes. These were not nobles. These were paper workers, the true builders of Burgundy's might. Why Burgundy needed a bureaucracy. The Valois Dukes of Burgundy governed not just Burgundy proper, but also a vast web of territories acquired through marriage, inheritance, and conquest, including Flanders, Artois, Brabant, and Franche-Comté. This made Burgundy a patchwork of legal systems, languages, currencies, and customs. French was spoken in Dijon, Dutch in Ghent, German in the East. Towns had their own privileges, nobles had unique exemptions. Laws were not uniform and taxes were not consistent. So how did Burgundy manage this complexity? With ledgers. Every privilege, charter, and exemption was documented, classified, and stored. Every town's obligations were cataloged. Every noble's dues were recorded. To survive, the duchy needed not just soldiers, but clerks who could find the right page. The rise of the Conseil. Under John the Fearless and later Philip the Good, the Burgundian court formalized its internal governance through a powerful institution, the Ducal Council, Conseil Ducal, which managed everything from diplomacy to taxation to justice. This council included chancellors, who oversaw all legal affairs, receivers general, who collected and reported revenues, secretaries, who maintained records and correspondence, jurists who interpreted overlapping laws. The council met regularly. Minutes were taken. Decisions were circulated to provinces in triplicate copies, complete with wax seals and regional countersignatures. One notable innovation was the use of ordinances, ducal ordinances written in plain French, intended to be understandable across the duchy. These edicts were distributed to town halls, churches, and guilds, and required public reading so that all citizens, regardless of literacy, could understand their duties. And all of this activity produced one thing in abundance: paper. The paper trail of power. Historians today are still uncovering the vast corpus of Burgundian administrative documents preserved in archives across France and Belgium. Among them, account books tracking income from tolls, markets, and ducal estates, diplomatic letters written in French, Latin, and Middle Dutch, recording negotiations with England, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy, judicial records, including property disputes, criminal sentences, and inheritance claims, marriage and dowry contracts, often involving immense sums and territorial claims. What makes these records extraordinary is not just their quantity, but their organization. The Burgundians pioneered file indexing, often marking scrolls with colored tabs, tags, or lead discs boits for easy retrieval. Clerks recorded marginal summaries on documents, a practice centuries ahead of modern archival methods. And the level of detail is astonishing. A 1441 register from Bruges lists the names of every merchant taxed for textile sales, with the exact amount, the date of transaction, and the type of cloth sold. This isn't chivalry, this is spreadsheet monarchy. The court as performance in filing cabinet. The Burgundian court, especially under Philip the Good, was one of the most opulent in Europe. Lavish feasts, elaborate tournaments, tapestries, and art all celebrated ducal majesty. But behind the spectacle was a rigidly run office system, maintained by hundreds of invisible workers. Every festival was planned with ledgers. Every costume had an inventory number. Every payment to musicians, chefs, and masons was authorized with a signature and recorded in a ledger now kept in the Archives de Dijon. One especially vivid example. During the Feast of the Pheasant, 1454, a grand event meant to rally Christian Europe for a crusade, the Burgundian court spent months preparing. Cloth orders were logged by tailors in Lille. Food purchases recorded by clerks in Bruges. Musicians hired and paid through a series of sealed contracts. The entire feast has been reconstructed by historians almost entirely through financial and administrative records, not chronicles, not paintings, but paper. Burgundy's bureaucrats, anonymous architects, who were the men behind all this paper. They were not famous. They left no monuments. Most remain nameless, their signatures scrawled at the bottom of accounts and orders. Yet their careers were steady and respectable. A Burgundian scribe might start as a copyist in a city hall, become a provincial auditor, and end his life as a secretary to the duke, surrounded by shelves of bundled charters. Their tools: goose quills, wax tablets, hand-bound codices, filing pins and scroll lockers. Above all, procedural memory, knowing what to write, where to write it, and when. Their power came not from charisma, but from consistency. And their legacy: a state that, for nearly a century, stood as a paper rival to the French crown itself. But Burgundy's might, like so many others, would not last forever. As the Valois line faltered, and as Charles the Bold met his end at Nancy in 1477, the duchy's paper empire began to unravel. Its ledgers were seized, split, lost, or absorbed. Its councils disbanded. Its offices fell silent. So we are left to wonder: if a realm can be built by parchment, seal, and ledger, can it be preserved by them once its rulers are gone? We return now to the Burgundian state, not in its grand halls or during its legendary feasts, but deep within the rooms that mattered most: the archives, the counting chambers, and the clerical offices. It is the late 15th century, and Burgundy, under the ambitious and often imperious rule of Charles the Bold, has grown into a complex conglomerate of duchies, counties, and cities stretching from eastern France to the Low Countries. But this is no mere feudal patchwork. It is a multi-regional state, stitched together not by brute force alone, but by something more enduring: administrative continuity. What Charles the Bold tried to build with his armies, his predecessors had long been crafting with forms, files, and formulas. Here, in Section 2, we explore how Burgundy's bureaucracy functioned across linguistic, legal, and territorial divides, and how its steady clerks maintained one of the most ambitious state-building projects in late medieval Europe. A realm of many tongues and laws. Burgundy was never a single, unified kingdom. It was a personal union of distinct regions. Duchy of Burgundy, centered on Dijon. County of Flanders. County of Artois. County of Hainaut. County of Namur. County of Holland. Brabant and Limburg. Franche-Comté. Each had its own customs, languages, and legal codes. Some spoke French, others Dutch, Walloon, or German dialects. Some regions operated under Roman legal traditions, others under Germanic customary law. Many towns had been granted extensive charters of autonomy, exempting them from standard taxes or requiring special legal procedures. For any other medieval ruler, this diversity might have caused paralysis. But Burgundy adapted by developing a parallel bureaucratic language, one based on translation, cross-referencing, and extreme documentation. If a law was passed in Dijon, it had to be translated into appropriate regional dialects, adapted to local legal customs, filed in duplicate once at the ducal court, once at the regional council, circulated to town officials, who were expected to publicly read or post the edict. This was not done casually. Entire departments in the ducal chancery were tasked with regional adaptation of laws. Legal scribes specialized in both language and jurisprudential interoperability, the tedious but critical process of ensuring that one law didn't contradict 30 local statutes. It was boring work, but it made Burgundy coherent. The administrative branches, how the state was run. By the 1450s, the Burgundian state had organized its bureaucracy into distinct but sometimes overlapping branches. Each operated according to internal protocols, with clerks, seals, offices, and registers. 1. The Great Council Grand Conseil functioned as the supreme legal body. Heard appeals from lower courts in all Burgundian territories. Judgments were written, signed, and stored with reference indexes for future citation. 2. The Chamber of Accounts, Chambre des Comptes, the financial nerve center, received reports from regional tax collectors and toll keepers, cross-checked income against expenditures, required quarterly submissions with itemized receipts, known as RALs, maintained books of defects, tracking unresolved discrepancies often down to missing coins or disputed market dues. 3. The Chancery managed legislation, correspondence, and diplomatic communiques, staffed with notaries, secretaries, and copyists, used color-coded wax seals to distinguish between categories of documents. 4. The Estates Etats Provinciaux, regional representative bodies for towns and nobles, sent reports, grievances, and petitions to the Duke, required that all communications be filed with supporting documentation. Each of these branches produced mountains of paperwork, and clerks served as its nervous system, transmitting information, ensuring fidelity to form, and maintaining the state's memory. The Burgundian clerk at work. What was it like to be a clerk in the Burgundian system? First, it meant immersion in routine. Days were structured not around drama, but around detail. A typical day might involve copying 5 or 6 letters of correspondence, sometimes in French, sometimes in Latin, verifying tax reports from a northern province, organizing incoming petitions by subject matter and urgency, drafting summaries in the margins of long charters for quick future reference. Their tools: ink made from gallnuts, iron salts, and vinegar, goose feather quills trimmed twice daily, wax and seal stamps stored in labeled drawers, lead boits or seals on strings to mark bound volumes. The highest praise a clerk could receive: that his hand was unseen, meaning no errors, no omissions, no embellishments. Precision was the only virtue. Many clerks worked in teams. One dictated, others wrote. In the copying rooms of the Burgundian chancery, one might hear 4 scribes copying the same document at once, their pens scratching in eerie syncopation. Information flow in a medieval state. What modern bureaucracies do with databases, Burgundy did with filed parchment. Clerks developed systems of cross-referencing to connect related documents. A letter of appointment, for example, would reference the recipient's oath document, which would itself refer back to an ancestral privilege, each filed separately but connected by marginal numbers and register entries. These systems allowed Burgundy to manage trade regulation across ports and inland towns, military supply lines with ledgers for grain, weapons, and boots, dispute mediation between towns, nobles, or religious houses, fiscal projections, some of which estimated revenues over 5-year cycles. In modern terms, this was a database built by hand, stored in wooden shelves, maintained by men whose job was to remember how the memory worked. Failures in the system. No system is perfect, and Burgundy's bureaucratic excellence sometimes failed spectacularly. Errors in transmission led to contradictory laws. Delays in tax reports caused budget shortfalls. Misfiled documents led to unresolved legal disputes that festered for years. Clerks, underpaid and overworked, were occasionally bribed to lose incriminating ledgers. Entire shipments of documents were sometimes lost in transit, washed away in river crossings, or destroyed by careless porters. Still, the system functioned better than many of its contemporaries. Its real vulnerability lay not in its paperwork, but in its politics. Because while Burgundy's files were in order, its succession was not. The problem of Charles the Bold. Charles the Bold, the last independent Duke of Burgundy, sought to transform his patchwork realm into a kingdom. He dreamed of uniting his French and Low Country possessions into a single, recognized monarchy, a state to rival France or the Holy Roman Empire. But Charles, for all his military might, was no administrator. He relied on the Burgundian machine, but did not fully understand it. He made sweeping decisions without consulting regional estates. He alienated cities whose paper privileges had long guaranteed loyalty. He dismissed complaints and ignored bureaucratic protocols in favor of grand strategy. And in 1477, at the Battle of Nancy, Charles died without a legitimate male heir. His death triggered not only a political crisis, but a bureaucratic scramble. Collapse by archive. Following Charles's death, King Louis XI of France moved quickly to absorb the Duchy of Burgundy into the crown's holdings. Burgundian territories in the Low Countries passed to the Habsburgs through Charles's daughter, Mary of Burgundy. But as armies moved and borders shifted, the documents remained. Louis XI sent clerks to Dijon to seize registries, copy ledgers, and archive privilege lists. Burgundian councils were dissolved, and their records partially incorporated into the French crown archives, often haphazardly. Meanwhile, in the Low Countries, Habsburg administrators kept many of the Burgundian systems intact. They simply changed the headers. Ducal orders became imperial decrees, but the filing systems, formulas, and even clerical handbooks persisted for decades. So even in death, Burgundy's bureaucratic legacy refused to vanish. A final question. If a government falls, but its records endure? If a state dissolves, but its paperwork survives? Did it truly collapse? The year is 1477. Charles the Bold is dead on a frosted battlefield outside Nancy, his frozen body discovered 3 days after the fight. His dream of a Burgundian kingdom, forged by war and bound by paper, has shattered. But though his banners have fallen, his files have not. As French and Habsburg armies race to claim the territories he once ruled, another, quieter race is underway. A contest for the archives, ledgers, seals, and administrative manuals that formed the skeleton of the Burgundian state. And it is this race not just of swords, but of clerks and copies that will determine which state inherits the machine of Burgundy, and which simply inherits its land. After the death of Charles, a bureaucracy divided. Following Charles's death, France and the Habsburgs carved up the Burgundian inheritance. The Duchy of Burgundy, centered on Dijon, was seized by Louis XI, reabsorbed into the French crown. The Burgundian Netherlands, including Flanders, Brabant, and Holland, passed to Mary of Burgundy, Charles's daughter, and through her marriage, to the House of Habsburg specifically, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. This geopolitical shift divided not only lands, but also the records. In Dijon, French administrators disbanded Burgundian institutions and replaced them with royal officers. Yet even Louis XI, known for his cunning and administrative savvy, recognized the value of the Burgundian ledger system. His agents collected, copied, and cataloged many of the ducal registers. These records were either stored in Paris or used to justify royal claims over former Burgundian territories. In the Low Countries, Maximilian preserved the Burgundian administrative framework, virtually intact. He reappointed many of the same clerks, maintained the councils and chambers, and even continued using Burgundian seals in legal documents for decades. Why? Because the Burgundian bureaucracy had proven itself functional, adaptable, and most importantly trusted. Even after its political death, Burgundy lived on in file drawers and index books. The copy lives on, bureaucracy beyond borders. What's fascinating about the Burgundian legacy is how portable it was. A system once tailored for a unique political configuration, part French, part imperial, part autonomous, became the foundation of statecraft in multiple countries. 1. In France, French kings borrowed heavily from Burgundian practices. Provincial councils modeled on Burgundian estates. Chambers of accounts with dual verified ledgers. Legal registries referencing privileges, much like those used in Ghent and Bruges. Though the French monarchy preferred centralization, it nonetheless absorbed many Burgundian filing conventions, especially for regions with complex legal histories. 2. In the Habsburg Netherlands. Here, the Burgundian system was not just copied, it was perfected. The Council of Mechelen, founded in 1473 by Charles the Bold, became the highest court in the Netherlands under Habsburg rule. It retained Burgundian document forms, seal designs, and minute-taking habits well into the 17th century. Ledgers from this period still bear the telltale signs of Burgundian procedure. Color-coded string bindings, margin-summarized entries, sequential cross-referencing across registers. The Central Chancellery in Brussels kept a record of every ducal and imperial act, building a continuity of governance that outlasted rulers. The hidden survivors, clerks after collapse. One of the most overlooked stories in this period is what happened to the clerks themselves. Many, especially in urban centers like Dijon, Lille, and Brussels, simply remained in their posts. They switched employers from the duke to the king or emperor, but they continued. Copying decrees, maintaining tax accounts, updating privilege lists. Their handwriting stayed the same, so did their ink. In some cases, the only change was the heading on their documents from Par la grâce du duc to Au nom du roi. This administrative continuity helped ease the political transition. Towns that feared royal repression were reassured by the presence of familiar procedures, unchanged officials, and known filing systems. It was not soldiers who brought peace, it was ledgers that stayed put. Burgundy's real power, precedent and proof. One of the great innovations of the Burgundian bureaucracy was its obsession with documentation as legitimacy. If a town claimed a tax exemption, it had to produce the original privilege or at least a certified copy, bearing the seal of a previous duke. If a noble challenged a law, he needed proof in the registers. This reliance on archival evidence laid the groundwork for modern administrative law. In the Habsburg Netherlands, for example, governors routinely consulted century-old Burgundian ledgers to settle disputes. These files became tools of governance, not just relics. More importantly, they formed the basis for state memory. Without kings, without armies, without territory, the idea of Burgundy could still be referenced by document. The cultural role of bureaucracy. While most see the Burgundian court as a center of art, chivalry, and pageantry, it was equally a laboratory of paper culture. Its obsession with form produced standardized letter forms, still referenced in French bureaucratic training well into the 18th century. Diplomatic filing systems, copied by Italian and Spanish courts. A professional class of career clerks, who were not aristocrats or clergy, but paper men educated, respected, and integral to the state. The image of power in Burgundy was not just the jousting knight or robed duke, but the ink-stained secretary with calloused fingers and a memory for privileged dates. Their work was invisible, but indispensable. A strange irony, Burgundy without a Burgundy. In later centuries, Burgundy came to symbolize fine wine, provincial charm, and a long-lost noble past. But the real Burgundy, the paper Burgundy, had already dissolved into the bureaucracies of Europe. It had no flag, no standing army, no surviving duke. Yet it lived on in tax codes, legal procedures, notarial forms, and archival traditions. In fact, many of the most dull, procedural aspects of modern European governance stamp registries, sequential file numbering, signature rules can trace their origins not to kings, but to clerks in Dijon and Bruges, filling out forms under flickering candlelight. A final reflection. Burgundy, as a state, did not last. Its lands were seized, its dukes died out, its ambitions failed. But its bureaucracy lived on. Through centuries of upheaval, the quiet work of clerks outlasted war, conquest, and dynastic collapse. They did not inspire loyalty with speeches. They inspired continuity through legibility. In many ways, the Burgundian state was a blueprint for how modern nations would organize themselves not with charisma, but with procedure. So we end with this question. If a kingdom can be remembered through its tapestries and tombs, can it also be remembered through folders, formulas, and filing tabs? And if so, how much of what we call modern government is simply Burgundy by another name? Story 5. The Criers of the Crown, the Royal Messengers' Long March. It is the early 14th century, and the King of France is not omnipresent. He does not live-stream proclamations from a velvet balcony. There is no internet, no printing press, no national radio. His orders must travel by hand and hoof, across muddy roads and through bandit-patrolled forests. Enter the royal messenger, sometimes called the courrier du roi, sometimes a hayrout, and in some cases simply a crieur, the crier. These men were the veins of the French kingdom, carrying the king's will from Paris to Provence, from Rouen to Roussillon. This is their story not of glory, but of travel, cold weather, torn saddlebags, and crumpled scrolls, each stamped with a wax seal and a command. In this world, logistics is law, and the ability to send and receive orders determines whether a monarchy holds or fragments. Let us walk, or rather ride, with the royal messengers across one of the most understated yet essential networks of medieval France. Communication as control, the king's voice on the road. For a medieval monarch to rule, he had to do more than fight battles or issue proclamations. He had to ensure those orders were delivered, understood, and obeyed. Without reliable communication, the kingdom fractured into independent spheres of action. A law declared in Paris meant little in Marseille if it took 6 weeks to arrive, or worse, if it never did. So the kings of France invested early in a rudimentary courier service, initially staffed by religious messengers, often monks traveling between abbeys, personal retainers hand-picked for loyalty, town criers tasked with public announcement. By the 13th century, this developed into a more structured system, and by the time of Philip IV, Philip the Fair, the French crown maintained a quasi-professional corps of messengers, trained to deliver sealed orders, tax requests, judicial summons, and foreign letters. They were not an army, but they had uniforms. They were not nobles, but they had credentials, known as letters de créance, documents proving their identity and authority to act on behalf of the king. They did not fight with swords, but they carried the king's most important weapon, information. The life of a messenger. Imagine the daily life of a royal courier in 1320. He receives a packet of documents at the Louvre, still a royal residence, not yet a museum. The orders are bundled in oiled leather, sealed with red wax and marked with routing instructions. He is told, "Ride to Lyon, deliver this to the bailiff, make your way through Bourgs, avoid the river route, bandits have been sighted." His gear includes a worn satchel, a dagger not for war, but for opening mail and fending off thieves, a passport from the crown, a soft conduit, offering him protection and priority at inns. He rides 10 to 15 hours a day, changing horses every 30-40 kilometers if possible. He carries no map, only oral instructions and local knowledge. He eats what he can afford or barter for. He sleeps in monasteries, stables, or town halls. At each stop, he may deliver copies of the same royal order, instructing multiple cities to increase tax quotas, prepare troops, or enforce new edicts. He may also be tasked with waiting for replies. Some messengers were bivalent, responsible not just for delivering messages, but for retrieving responses, signatures, and local seals. This is not an exciting life. It is repetitive, dangerous, isolating. And yet, it holds the kingdom together. Speed and secrecy, the king's timetable. The value of the messenger was measured by speed, secrecy, and survivability. While travel times varied by weather, terrain, and political unrest, the best royal messengers could cover 100-120 kilometers per day, assuming fresh horses and clear roads. More often, they averaged 40-50 kilometers, adjusting for delays. Messengers were instructed not to linger. Some orders even specified exact dates for arrival, and delays could result in disciplinary measures, including lost pay or reassignment. To ensure security, some documents were sealed with multiple layers of wax, sometimes bearing embedded thread patterns, which would show signs of tampering. In extreme cases, code words or number substitutions were used, early forms of encryption. Yet accidents happened. A messenger was once waylaid in Gascony and had his satchel stolen by local mercenaries. In Brittany, a courier was executed by rebels, his body found with royal seals still intact. In the Alps, a document was destroyed in a snowstorm, forcing the entire message to be retranscribed from memory. The price of failure was not only personal, it could destabilize entire regions. Infrastructure for information, the relay system. To improve reliability, the Crown developed a network of relay stations, known as relay de poste, where messengers could change horses, rest, and hand off packets to fresh riders. This system was especially prominent in royal highways, chemins routes, connecting major cities like Paris, Orleans, Tours, and Bordeaux. Border towns, where speed was essential for diplomatic coordination. Judicial routes, enabling courts to issue summons or enforce edicts. Each station was manned by postmasters, often locals who provided horses, hay, food, and shelter. Their logs documented name of arriving courier, time of arrival and departure, route taken, whether the message was successfully passed on. These logs are still preserved in some regional archives, offering a rare glimpse into the skeletal framework of medieval logistics. It was not glamorous, but it worked. The message itself, what they carried. The messengers were not mere deliverermen, they carried the kingdom's will. Their satchels included ordinances, legal decrees to be read aloud in town squares. Letters patent, open letters establishing appointments, charters, or privileges. Letters close, sealed messages addressed to a specific person, often judicial or financial in nature. Financial demands, tax orders, toll notices, conscription lists. Military orders, instructions for garrisons, commanders, or levies. Treaty drafts, diplomatic correspondence between France and neighboring powers. Sometimes, messengers carried blank parchment, ink, and a wax stamp to record replies, acknowledgments, or even emergency notices to return to court. Each message had to be logged at the point of departure, stamped or sealed at every major checkpoint, delivered directly to the intended official, who would sign a receipt or counterseal the message. The paperwork generated by these exchanges became part of the kingdom's permanent record, and often survives to this day in dusty volumes labeled Correspondance de la Couronne. Town criers, the public arm. Not all royal messengers traveled long distances. In each major town, the king's orders were also proclaimed by public criers, men employed by city councils or directly by the bailiff's office. These criers read tax notices, price regulations, announcements of war, famine, or plague, royal edicts affecting commerce, property, or law. They were required to read in public places, often near markets or churches. Use a clear, formal voice, often repeating the message multiple times. Confirm the proclamation with a town clerk or local scribe, who logged the event. It was not unusual for criers to repeat the same proclamation daily for a week, especially in cases involving new regulations. In towns with low literacy, these public announcements were often the only contact citizens had with the crown. But a question rises from all this movement, ink, and noise. If a king's voice can only travel by horse and echo from the mouths of criers, what happens when that voice becomes too distant or too tangled in paper and protocol? In other words, can a monarchy survive if its messengers cannot keep pace with its ambition? When we last followed the royal messenger, he was galloping through muddy roads, clutching a leather satchel stuffed with sealed scrolls. The year may be 1320 or 1450. The job, remarkably, remains much the same. As the French monarchy expanded its bureaucracy, law, and influence across a patchwork kingdom of territories, languages, and loyalties, the messenger's work grew not only more critical, but more complex. In this section, we step deeper into the operational tangle of medieval communication. From route planning and relay logistics to the dangers of dissent, we explore how royal messengers managed to navigate a growing kingdom in a time before maps were reliable, and when loyalty often stopped at the city wall. The messenger was not simply a traveler, he was a thread binding a fractious realm. Mapping the kingdom without maps. Contrary to modern assumptions, most messengers did not use physical maps. Paper was expensive, and accurate cartography remained the purview of monks, surveyors, and the occasional court cosmographer. Messengers relied on memory. Apprenticed couriers learned routes by shadowing veterans. Way stations, relay points, and posting inns served as geographic anchors. Landmarks, rivers, abbeys, walled cities, and forests marked known positions. Oral directions. At each stop, local officials provided updates on road conditions, detours, or danger zones. The Crown did issue written route guides, basic instructions outlining major paths, travel times, and station masters, but these were general at best. A messenger traveling from Paris to Avignon might have been instructed to pass through Orléans, Bourges, Limoges, Toulouse, and then veer east. But detours were common. A washed-out bridge, a town under siege, or a regional fair could redirect a journey by days or even weeks. This lack of reliable infrastructure made the job a test of adaptability, not just endurance. The relay system, a royal web of hooves. By the late 14th century, the French monarchy had formalized a relay network, known as the courier system, chevatures de poste. At roughly 30 to 40 km intervals, the state established posting stations, or relays, where messengers could exchange horses, often for a fee paid in advance or logged to the crown. Rest and eat, sometimes under the protection of the town. Deliver minor packets, which were carried onward by local deputies. A full ride from Paris to Marseille, some 750 km, might involve 20 or more station changes, each one requiring precise timing, careful record-keeping, and cooperation with regional authorities. Some larger stations even employed on-site scribes, who would note time of arrival, departure, identity of courier, type of dispatch, quality of horse and baggage. These records served as a primitive timekeeping system, allowing the Crown to audit performance or punish delays. Riding with authority, the lettre de créance. To protect the messenger and his message, the Crown issued the lettre de créance, a formal letter of authority, stating that the bearer carried royal commands and was to be assisted, not hindered. These documents were usually sealed with the king's privy seal, written in formal language and issued per mission, not permanently. Recognized by regional bailiffs, town mayors, military commanders, and even foreign courts. With this letter, a messenger could demand fresh horses from designated stations, request lodgings in royal or ecclesiastical houses, avoid tolls, inspections, or local levies, escape imprisonment in theory if detained by mistake. But theory and reality often clashed. A messenger caught in rebel-held territory could be arrested, interrogated, or worse. There were cases in Normandy and Languedoc where royal couriers were imprisoned by local lords, their letters ignored or destroyed. Even within royal territory, suspicion abounded. One Parisian messenger was detained by a provincial bailiff who refused to believe his credentials. The bailiff was later fined, but the courier lost 8 days. The lettre de créance was power, but only if others agreed to respect it. Danger on the roads: bandits, rebels, and war. The greatest threats to the messengers were not deadlines but violence. France in the Middle Ages was not a stable country. During the 100 Years' War 1337–1453, entire provinces changed hands. In Burgundy, Aquitaine, and Brittany, shifting loyalties made any uniformed courier a potential target. Messengers faced ambushes by highwaymen, often at river crossings or in forests, attacks by soldiers, especially during troop movements, detainment by suspicious towns, fearful of spies or provocateurs. Some messengers were forced to ride with escorts, typically 3 to 5 lightly armed guards. This slowed travel and drew more attention, but in dangerous regions, it was the only viable option. The Crown even kept records of lost messengers, including names, mission objectives, last known routes, theories of disappearance. Many were never found. It is estimated that between 5% and 10% of long-distance messengers in wartime did not complete their assignments due not to failure, but fatal interruption. And yet new messengers came. The pay was low, the risk was high. But for some disgraced soldiers, literate sons of artisans, minor clerics, it was a way into the machine of the state. The training of a messenger. Though not a formal guild, royal messengers were often apprenticed, beginning as assistant writers or scribes. Over time, they learned route memory. Without written maps, recall was key. Reading and writing. Not all messengers could write fluently, but most were literate. Seal recognition. Knowing the difference between royal, ecclesiastical, and ducal seals. Political awareness. Understanding which regions were safe, neutral, or hostile. Training also included etiquette: how to approach a lord, address a magistrate, or announce a royal decree. A skilled messenger could expect recognition by name in court records, occasional bonuses, and sometimes even a retirement post as a clerk in a provincial office. But many died young, their names forgotten. Their only legacy, a line in a register. Jean de Mont, Messenger du Roi, disparu en route pour Bordeaux, 1374. Messengers and the Crown's perception. Beyond logistics, the royal messengers influenced how the crown was seen across the country. The speed and quality of messenger service could affect how quickly justice was delivered, whether tax orders were met, how towns responded to royal crises. In this sense, messengers acted as ambassadors of efficiency. A town that received late, unclear, or contradictory messages from the crown might assume incompetence or even malevolence. In contrast, timely and well-sealed orders projected stability and legitimacy. There are even cases where towns wrote back to the king complaining not about the order itself, but about how sloppily it was delivered. The man bore no proper seal, spoke in coarse French, and seemed unaware of his destination. We feared it was a fraud. Thus, the reputation of monarchy, at least at a provincial level, was tied not only to what was said, but to who delivered it and how. A question in the dust. Imagine a parchment, curled by age, found in a French archive. It lists the names of 4 towns, a date, and a royal order regarding tax levies for winter grain. At the bottom, the mark of a messenger, just a scrawl, no signature. That messenger never ruled. He never led an army. He carried no sword. But he carried the kingdom. And so we ask, if a monarchy rests on parchment, and parchment rides on horseback, is the messenger not the true bearer of the crown? The gallop of a royal messenger eventually slows. His mount, once swift, is retired. His parchment deliveries yield to paper trails, ledgers, and bureaucratic filing cabinets. The roads that once bore the king's voice become quieter as the architecture of communication changes and the state evolves. But the messengers leave behind more than hoofprints. Their journeys, struggles, and habits planted the seeds of modern postal services, government logistics, and centralized administration. In this final section, we explore how these obscure travelers laid the groundwork for something far more permanent than royal decrees: the institutional memory of the state. From gallop to governance, standardizing the kingdom. By the 15th century, especially under kings like Charles VII and Louis XI, France was no longer just a loose collection of fiefs and duchies. It was becoming a centralized monarchy. And with centralization came a demand for faster dispatch, reliable receipt, uniformity in transmission. The royal messenger system, once ad hoc and dependent on individual grit, was slowly formalized. This process included document templates, standard formats for letters, patent, edicts, and notices; messenger registers, logs recording who carried what, where, and when; pay schedules, set rates for delivery, distance, and hazard level; enforcement mechanisms, legal repercussions for those who delayed or tampered with communications. This transition marked a shift from messengers as men on horseback to messengers as arms of the administrative state. The human element, memory, improvisation, personal trust began to give way to procedures. The birth of the French postal service. The institutional evolution of the royal messenger system reached a milestone in 1477, when Louis XI established the royal post, La Poste Royale, a relay-based communication system designed for government use. This new network included fixed postal stations every 6-10 leagues, roughly 25-40 km. Professional couriers hired and rotated on regular shifts. Horse inventories maintained at each post. Permanent route maps for major corridors, e.g. Paris, Lyon, Paris, Rouen, Paris, Bordeaux. Though still inaccessible to commoners, this system represented a monumental leap in communication infrastructure. It allowed royal commands, tax orders, and military directives to be dispatched in days instead of weeks. Over time, this network evolved into France's national postal system, first opened to private use in the 17th century under Louis XIV, and eventually modernized in the Napoleonic era. Thus, the royal messenger's gallop became the sinew of a modern nation-state, stretching between palace and province. What was lost the end of the messenger's world? As with all transformations, something was lost. The early royal messengers were not merely parts of a machine, they were independent agents, sometimes acting as negotiators, witnesses, or informal spies. They reported road conditions, political unrest, towns that failed to post proclamations, reactions to royal law. Their unwritten observations passed to secretaries, whispered in chancelleries, shaped royal perception far beyond what ink could capture. This feedback loop made the crown not just a sender of messages, but a listener. But bureaucracy prefers controlled inputs. Over time, the role of messengers was stripped to its essentials. Deliver the packet. Log the route. Confirm receipt. The flexible intelligence once embedded in the messenger's mind was replaced by written memos and formal reports. Efficiency improved, but the richness of human intelligence faded. The messenger became not a conduit, but a conveyor. Legacy in paper and procedure. Though individual messengers faded from historical memory, their impact endured in the structure of governance itself. Here's how. 1. Protocols of dispatch. The habits of messengers, double sealing, route confirmation, archiving receipts became embedded in bureaucratic workflow. Many of these practices persist today in registered mail procedures, government record-keeping, diplomatic pouch protocols. 2. The administrative state. The Crown's reliance on dispatch and receipt led to the expansion of clerical offices to track messages, legal standards for proof of notification, regional documentation centers, precursors to modern prefectures. In short, the messenger forced the creation of an interface between ruler and ruled, made of ink, travel, and time. 3. Political geography. The roads and routes developed for messengers, often through geographic necessity, influenced the later division of provinces, including postal regions and judicial districts. Messengers, in their choices of path and stop, charted the arteries of the state. The European impact, France and beyond. France was not alone. Royal messenger systems were mirrored across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire used mounted couriers to bridge distant principalities. England's royal writs traveled with trusted riders to sheriffs and judges. The papal curia maintained messengers to coordinate church decrees across Christendom. But France's system was among the earliest to become centralized and state-run, a model that would inspire later absolutist regimes, including Prussia and Spain. The Poste Royale became not just a French institution, but a continental blueprint. Voices in the square, the town crier's final echo. Alongside mounted messengers, the town crier persisted into the modern age. Even as printed pamphlets spread, many communities, especially rural ones, relied on criers to read legal mandates, announce executions, taxes, or harvest notices, deliver proclamations aloud in vernacular dialects. In some areas, criers were expected to walk regular circuits, sounding a bell or horn to gather listeners. Their speech patterns, repetitive, rhythmic, formal, preserved the oral culture of governance long after parchment became dominant. They were the last echo of a time when the state was a voice, not a document. A thought on obscurity. Royal messengers were rarely recorded unless they failed. When they succeeded, the document moved. The law was heard, and the king's will was known, but the messenger's name was not. They were not heroes. They were not rebels or generals or martyrs. They were facilitators. But perhaps that is the quiet genius of their role. They did not shape history, but allowed it to be enacted. They were the footnotes in the margins, and yet, without them, the page itself could not turn. Final reflection. History favors the loud the kings, the conquest the crises. But beneath it all moves a quieter rhythm, the sound of hoofbeats on gravel roads, the whisper of parchment unrolled in candlelight, the echo of a voice calling, "Oyez, oyez." France's royal messengers and criers did not write laws, but they made laws real. They brought the center to the edges. They connected monarchs to markets, dukes to their duties, and edicts to ears. Their legacy is not found in marble statues or grand tombs, but in the enduring structures of communication, bureaucracy, and public order. So the next time you receive a notice in your mailbox or hear a public announcement, pause for a moment. You are witnessing the distant descendant of a world where a saddle-worn rider, armed only with seal and scroll, rode through the night to make a kingdom work. And we end with a final question. If history is a matter of what is preserved and what is forgotten, what other lives now buried in ledgers and footnotes shaped our world, one message at a time? Story 6. The Parliament of Sleep. Daily life in the Estates General. You are seated on a hard wooden bench, stiff with the cold, surrounded by murmurs and parchment rustling. The hall is grand, but not ornate, more functional than majestic. Somewhere ahead, a voice is reading a decree in a formal monotone. The ink is still wet, the words rehearsed but unclear. You're not sure if you're supposed to agree, nod, object, or simply keep listening. This is France, and the year is 1302. You are present for the first full gathering of the Estates General Etats Généraux, not a legislature, not a parliament as we understand today, but something tentatively new. A collection of France's many social orders, assembled not to rule, but to be consulted. It is not quite democracy. It is not quite autocracy. It is somewhere in between, a meeting of the kingdom with itself, a symbolic exercise whose details, by modern standards, are astonishingly dull, and yet whose consequences are enduring. This is the boring history of early political assembly, of procedural tedium, of noble grievances and tax appeals. But through this procedural fog emerges an essential idea, that power, even royal, must sometimes explain itself. Let us enter the room. What was the Estates General? The Estates General was not a parliament in the English sense. It was not permanent. It did not pass laws. It had no chambers, no formal opposition, no routine calendar. It was, rather, a council of orders summoned by the king at his discretion. The three estates represented the basic structure of society. First estate, the clergy, bishops, abbots, and senior churchmen. Second estate, the nobility, dukes, barons, knights, and seigneurs. Third estate, everyone else, a catch-all for town burghers, lawyers, merchants, and occasionally peasants. The Estates General would gather when the king wanted their opinion, needed support for taxation, or sought to give legitimacy to controversial policies. He was not bound by their advice. The first formal session was in 1302 under Philip IV, Philip the Fair, in response to a dramatic conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, who had challenged the king's authority. Needing national backing, Philip convened the estates in Notre Dame, Paris, presenting them with a document criticizing the Pope. It worked. The estates backed the king. Their collective voice gave weight to his position. But the moment had deeper meaning. For the first time, France saw its diverse social orders not just as a hierarchy, but as a body politic, capable of hearing, reacting, and if permitted, advising. Setting the scene, a meeting of the estates. The logistics were complex, but predictable. Delegates were summoned by royal letters, often carried by the very messengers we've just studied. They were elected or appointed within their estate, depending on local custom. Delegates were expected to arrive with grievances, proposals, and occasionally a mandate from their constituency. Meetings were usually held in cathedrals, royal halls, or large monasteries, since few buildings could accommodate hundreds of delegates. Inside, proceedings were Hierarchical clergy and nobility sat at the front, commoners to the rear. Formal proceedings were opened by a royal official or chancellor. Each estate deliberated separately before any unified position was presented. These sessions could last days or weeks, depending on urgency. And they were rarely exciting. Most of the time was spent reading out royal proposals, listening to lengthy legal explanations, recording statements and objections by hand, returning home with no clear resolution. But the symbolic act of being asked carried power, the boring power of procedure. To modern ears, the Estates General may sound toothless, but its power lay in its process. Even without binding authority, the very act of summoning delegates, recording grievances, and formally responding to petitions created a sense that France was more than a king and his court. It created a precedent, consultation, not merely command. One historian referred to these early estates meetings as the architecture of doubt, moments when the crown, in the face of crisis or financial need, had to pause and explain itself, if only briefly. This process slowed decision-making, emboldened local elites, created archives of grievances, called cahiers de doléances, that would later become fuel for rebellion. No revolution begins with fire, it begins with lists. Who was actually in the room? Despite the rhetoric of all France represented, the actual delegates were a narrow band. The First Estate was dominated by high-ranking bishops and abbots, men more loyal to the crown than the Pope. The Second Estate often featured landed nobles, many of whom had little interest in national politics, preferring local autonomy. The Third Estate in this period was largely drawn from urban elites, not peasants, but lawyers, merchants, and literate administrators. Most delegates were male, literate in Latin or French, already wealthy or influential in their localities. They did not sleep on straw or walk barefoot. Many had servants and stipends for travel. Some used their attendance to curry favor with the crown. Yet within their speeches and documents, we hear real concerns: local corruption, tax abuses, church overreach, lack of protection on the roads. This was not revolution, but it was complaint, formal, recorded, persistent. Early impact, more than symbolic. Though the Estates General had no legal teeth, its convening mattered. It legitimized controversial royal policies, especially in crises. It provided the crown with financial cover. Tax increases felt approved. It acted as a pressure valve, allowing elites to vent without rebelling. Over time, it also shaped the language of political life. Delegates began using phrases like the will of the kingdom or the common good. Royal decrees increasingly referenced in the presence and consent of the estates. It was a stage, a slow, meticulous, frustrating stage, where the idea of shared interest began to be rehearsed. Still, the Estates General remained rare. Between 1302 and 1614, it was only convened a few dozen times. Yet every time it returned, the expectations grew. From consultation to confrontation. The Estates General was not born to challenge the king, but it eventually would. Why? Because repeated consultation created institutional memory. Delegates began to compare grievances across regions. Towns sent more articulate representatives. Petitions grew longer, more assertive. The estates began to think of themselves not just as invited guests, but as part of governance. This shift was slow but steady. In the early 15th century, the estates of Languedoc began meeting on their own, issuing collective tax statements to the crown. In Brittany, nobles used their estate to push back against royal military levies. By the 16th century, some estates general sessions became tense debates, with the Third Estate asking, If we must pay, should we not also decide? And here we glimpse the future not yet arrived, but visible. As we close this section, consider the image: a crowded, chilly room full of murmuring men rereading a decree for the third time. Outside, horses wait. The roads home are long, but still they sit, amend, and speak. If speech itself was limited, then perhaps silence recorded, measured, endured was the first true language of political resistance. What happens when even symbolic speech is heard too clearly, or too often? Could the Estates become more than a stage? We return to the Estates General not with a shout, but with a shuffle. The scene remains the same: parchment, benches, cloaks pulled tightly against the draft. In this section, we descend into the slow, methodical tedium of the estate's proceedings. While great revolutions are etched into memory with fireworks, the foundations of representation are built through prolonged negotiation, repetitive complaint, and procedural minutiae. This is the engine room of early French consultative governance. Slow-moving committees, provincial demands, disputes over wording, and eternal questions of who speaks, who decides, and who pays. It is here, amid the scribes and sighs, that the culture of bureaucracy is born. The structure of debate. Once the Estates General were convened and formally opened, they quickly split into three separate chambers, though these were often just distinct wings of a church or hall. Each estate deliberated independently, developing its own response to royal requests. There was no joint voting, no majority rule. The clergy would retreat to compose their response, often consulting with church authorities. The nobility gathered to refine their own privileges, which they guarded jealously. The Third Estate, often the largest group, spent the most time collecting grievances and debating financial burdens. Each group then sent their conclusions, known as remonstrances or dalliances, to the crown. This process could take days, even weeks, and often resulted in contradictory advice. The First Estate might support a tax for military defense. The Second Estate might oppose it, citing exemptions or land rights. The Third Estate might support the tax, but demand reforms and oversight. There was no mechanism for reconciling these differences. The king would acknowledge their counsel and do what he had planned anyway. Yet these contradictions were preserved, often in meticulous detail, copied by scribes and archived. They created a historical record of discontent, and this record would later be used against the monarchy itself. Cahiers de dalliances, the kingdom's complaint box. Perhaps the most enduring output of these meetings was the Cahiers de dalliances, literally, notebook of grievances. Each locality, a village, town, or city would draw up a list of complaints and suggestions, written and carried by its delegates to the estates. These were remarkably detailed and often painfully mundane. For example, the road between St. Florent and the mill is impassable in spring. The salt tax is unfairly applied to widows. Tithes are collected before the harvest is in. Yet amid these local concerns were broader themes: calls for judicial reform, limits on tax exemptions for nobles, greater protection from seigneurial abuse, standardization of weights and measures. In short, a desire for fairness, even if its language was not yet revolutionary. The cahiers were not mere venting. They were part of a growing culture of consultation. The crown might not heed their contents, but it could no longer pretend these voices did not exist. Some cahiers were copied in triplicate, one for the local record, one for the delegates, and one for the royal court. They became documents of accountability, even if action rarely followed. The role of the chancellor and royal officials. At the heart of the Estates General's bureaucracy was the Chancellor of France, or his representative, often a royal notary or counselor. This figure played multiple roles: opening the session with a speech on royal intent, collecting and cataloging the cahiers and remonstrances, reporting back to the king. He was the crown's voice in the room, but also a witness to the kingdom's voice. Chancellors often used careful language, framing the estate's role as advisory but respected, avoiding overt reminders of royal supremacy while still maintaining authority. Interestingly, some chancellors became sympathetic to Third Estate grievances, especially when they were literate men of legal or clerical background. Their reports to the king often included unofficial reflections. The towns of Champagne expressed unusual unity in their plea for fixed grain tariffs. Their logic is sound, though I caution against immediate implementation. These internal memos helped the monarchy navigate discontent, but they also showed that the state was starting to listen, if not yet to obey. Dress, decorum, and order, visual hierarchies of the estates. The Estates General was a deeply symbolic event, and nowhere was this clearer than in dress and protocol. The First Estate wore ecclesiastical robes, black or crimson depending on rank. The Second Estate arrived in noble attire, doublets, cloaks, and swords, though they were usually piece-dyed. The Third Estate was expected to appear in modest but formal clothes, often black or gray, with no weapons. Seating reflected this hierarchy. Clergy in front, nobles beside or behind, and the Third Estate in the rear, sometimes even in separate annexes. Only certain delegates could address the whole assembly, usually pre-approved by the crown. These visual divisions were intentionally reinforced. The estates were not meant to be equal. They were meant to be representative not of individual citizens, but of estates as corporate bodies. And yet, these carefully maintained separations often gave rise to resentment, particularly among the educated bourgeoisie of the Third Estate. A Parisian merchant delegate wrote in 1576, "Our seats are in shadow, our voices limited, our presence tolerated, yet we pay more than the priests and wield more coin than the knights." Such comments, scribbled in margins and personal diaries, reveal the slow burn of political frustration. The Estates General and taxation, a familiar battle. The most common reason for convening the Estates General was, predictably, money. War, famine, infrastructure, and royal debts required new taxes, and although the king had the legal right to impose them, he often sought political cover. The First Estate sometimes agreed, provided church lands remained untouched. The Second Estate was typically hostile, citing ancient exemptions. The Third Estate, ironically, was often willing to support taxation but demanded greater oversight. This led to protracted haggling, with royal officials promising reform of collection methods, limits on abuses by tax farmers, transparent accounting, though rarely delivered. Delegates might argue for days over a single tariff increase, or whether a war tax should be temporary or permanent. In 1484, during a rare session convened after Louis XI's death, the Third Estate refused to grant funds unless the Crown agreed to convene the estates regularly. The Crown ignored the demand, but the idea had been spoken and written down. The fatigue of futility. There is a reason the Estates General earned the disdain of absolutist kings. It was slow, it was unpredictable, it encouraged debate when silence was easier. Many delegates, especially those from distant towns, found the experience frustrating. Weeks of travel, endless waiting, little clarity on outcomes. Some left early, others submitted their cahiers and returned home, having done their duty but doubting the result. And yet, despite the inefficiency, the estates endured not because they were effective, but because they satisfied a symbolic need. They allowed the crown to project legitimacy. They allowed the people to feel heard. And over time, symbolic legitimacy proved more fragile than gold. As we close this section, imagine the scene. A minor town clerk sits by candlelight, finishing a copy of his city's cahier. He stacks the parchment, ties it with a ribbon, and places it in a satchel for the delegate to carry. He does not know if anyone will read it. He does not know if it will change anything. But he writes it anyway, because something he believes should be recorded. And we must now ask, what happens when 100 such voices, recorded in quiet ink, begin to speak louder than the king? The room is quiet now. The seats are empty, the parchment folded away, the cloaks gone from their pegs. The Estates General has been dismissed. The king has returned to his council. Nothing, it seems, has changed. But change is rarely visible in the moment. It creeps between moments of silence in what was written, what was heard, and what was quietly resented. And in France, over the course of 4 long centuries, the Estates General would slowly transform from a ceremonial gesture to a lightning rod of revolution. In this final section, we trace how the Estates General, so tedious, procedural, and restrained, mutated under pressure, and eventually exploded into history in 1789. From whispered cahiers to shouted decrees, from ignored petitions to stormed palaces, we follow how an instrument of legitimacy became a weapon of revolt. The Estates slumber 1614 to 1789. After its final convening in 1614, the Estates General fell into disuse for nearly 175 years. Why? Absolute monarchy had triumphed. Under Louis XIII and especially Louis XIV, the Sun King, the French monarchy consolidated power so thoroughly that consultation became obsolete. The king ruled by divine right, not popular consent. His will was the law. Institutions like the parliaments, high courts, and intendants, royal administrators, became the primary instruments of governance. The Estates General, unpredictable, slow, and often critical, was simply not useful anymore. The archives of grievances, the procedural headaches, the divided voices, all were replaced with the efficiency of autocracy. The cahiers gathered dust. But while the estates slept, the world changed. The world grows louder. Between 1614 and 1789, France experienced multiple wars, massive national debt, a rising middle class, the bourgeoisie, an increasingly literate third estate, Enlightenment thinkers questioning absolute power. And while the Estates General did not meet, local estates assemblies in regions like Brittany, Burgundy, and Languedoc continued to operate, especially around taxation. These bodies kept the culture of grievance alive. Moreover, the memory of 1302, 1484, and other past gatherings remained in legal texts and political theory. By the late 18th century, the phrase Estates General had taken on mythic weight, a symbol of national consultation, even if few alive had ever witnessed it. So when France's debt crisis peaked in the 1780s, and when public pressure demanded reform, there was one idea that returned to the center of discussion. Let the Estates General meet again. 1789, the return of the Estates General. King Louis XVI, facing fiscal collapse and public unrest, agreed to summon the Estates General for the first time in nearly 2 centuries. It was scheduled for May 1789. Over 1,200 deputies were elected, 291 for the clergy, 270 for the nobility, and 578 for the Third Estate. Each delegate arrived with cahiers de doléances, gathered in villages and towns across France, echoing the practices of the 1300s and 1400s. But everything was different. The Third Estate was more literate, organized, and politically aware than ever before. Pamphlets circulated, coffeehouse debates roared. Philosophers like Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire had reshaped the intellectual climate. What had once been a formal exercise now became a charged arena of competing visions. And then came the core dispute, the same one that had haunted the estates for centuries. Should each estate vote separately, as tradition dictated, or should all deputies vote together, giving the Third Estate real power? When the king refused reform, the Third Estate responded with decisive insubordination. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, claiming to represent the sovereign will of the nation. 3 days later, locked out of their meeting hall, they reconvened in a nearby indoor tennis court and swore the now famous tennis court oath. We will not separate until we have given France a constitution. The Estates General, so long a stage for obedience, had become the birthplace of revolution. What did the Estates actually teach? The Estates General had always been a lesson in contradiction. It was about representation, but not equality. It invited speech, but rarely listened. It called the kingdom together, then kept it apart. Yet those contradictions proved powerful. They trained generations of clerks, lawyers, and delegates to write grievances, organize constituencies, and expect to be consulted. It was, in effect, a centuries-long rehearsal for modern democracy, even if it never meant to be. The processes of the estates, tedious, repetitive, and ceremonial, became templates for action. The cahier taught people how to articulate demands. The delegate system taught them how to choose representatives. The divisions within the estates taught them how inequality was enforced and how it might be challenged. The very failure of the Estates General to resolve France's tensions made it, paradoxically, an ideal platform to explode them. The last grievances, the cahiers of 1789, are perhaps the most striking window into France's collective mood on the eve of revolution. Some examples. We demand that all citizens be equal before the law. Let the burdens of taxation be shared by all. Let the estates meet regularly, not at the king's whim. Let merit, not birth, determine office. What had once been minor requests, grain prices, river maintenance, road repairs, had now transformed into a constitutional program. In thousands of pages of orderly handwriting, France imagined a new political future. The process was still boring, still bureaucratic, but now it contained fire. The estates as memory. After 1789, the Estates General would never return in its old form. The National Assembly replaced it. France would experiment with republics, empires, monarchies, and finally democracy. The old tripartite structure, clergy, nobility, Third Estate, was dissolved. But its memory endured. In how parliaments were structured, in how elections were justified, in how public demands were expressed. Even today, in modern France, the echoes remain in local assemblies, in citizen petitions, in national consultations. The Estates General, in all its sluggishness, taught a kingdom to listen to itself. Final reflection. Imagine once more that bench, that cold hall, that delegate reading his cahier by candlelight, unsure if it matters. Now imagine that same room, 175 years later, filled with furious oratory and shouted oaths, as a monarchy stumbles. In between these two scenes lies the story of how boring history becomes explosive history. The Estates General did not plan to awaken France, but in teaching it to speak, however slowly, it also taught it to demand. And that, perhaps, is the paradox of bureaucracy, that even when designed to pacify, it creates the tools by which it might one day be overturned. So the next time you fill out a petition, wait in a queue, or attend a public meeting that feels futile, remember, even boredom has a memory. And sometimes it remembers how to fight.